So, let's pray before we get started. So, Heavenly Father, thank you for this day. Thank you that we can come together and learn a little bit about science, about what it can tell us, what it can't tell us, and where religion comes into play with that. Thank you for everyone that came out here to learn, and please let me and Cal just be able to speak within your will, Lord. Just pray. Amen.
Amen.
So, just real briefly, I'm going to introduce it real quick. Cal's going to take over and do the history. But we're going to be talking about the philosophy of science. We kind of primed this last week. It's going to be the nature of reasoning mostly this week, and we're going to prime how does reasoning interline with science and what can science actually teach us. And then we're probably going to take at least 2 more weeks after this to talk about how that interrelates with religion and science.
Yep. Yeah, so this is the first week of a 3-part series.
At least, yeah.
Talking about science, what assumptions does it make, where does it come from, how does it fit in the greater Christian worldview, etc.
Yeah. Just, I guess, briefly for me, I need to do a better job of giving my resources of where I'm getting my stuff from, because I was just like going to talking like I know what I'm talking about, but I typically get them from different books. So this one I got from a book called Science and Its Limits, or at least the stuff I'm going to be talking about. By I think David Rash is his name. He's a professor at Calvin University. Really great book if you're interested in this topic. Yeah,
for sure. So if you're a Christian, you may have heard this before. Well, so a common objection, I should say, that we get from non-Christians is, well, I believe in science. And the point being, well, Christianity doesn't necessarily agree with science. That would be their claim. And while there are many great resources to address that claim, like Answers in Genesis is a really, really great one to go over, like, well, what about evolution? What about the age of the earth? What about, the fossil record, etc.? That's not really what this class is about. This class is primarily about what is actually science. And so when someone says, I believe in science, what are they actually claiming? What do they mean when they're saying that? Versus what are they actually claiming? Because the reality is that science has assumptions, and those assumptions actually directly lead you to God.
And it limits what science can tell you as well.
Exactly, and it also limits what science can tell you. So, so first things first, we're going to go over a little primer of philosophy. The term philosophy comes from the ancient Greek word philosophia, which literally means loving knowledge, or like loving wisdom. Interestingly enough, the term wasn't actually coined until, I believe, around the 1300s AD. So some guy in the Middle Ages used the word and decided that he wanted to put 2 ancient Greek words together to make the term philosophy. So kind of interesting. It's a very wide field. It covers pretty much anything having to do with foundational knowledge, reason, the purpose of life, existence, etc. And so there's a bunch of different branches of philosophy, which all try to limit their field of study so that they can go deeper and not have to deal with so many different thoughts. It's like theology, for example, literally means God study or the study of God. Epistemology is literally knowledge, study. That term, like ology, is either means study or like story of. So the story of a word is called an etymology, which I'm giving you many stories of different words right now. Logic, study of reasoning, ethics, how we ought to behave, etc. So when we talk about philosophy, there's 2 concepts. One is the literally love of knowledge, but everyone kind of comes to their own personal philosophy. In Christian circles, we often call this your worldview. It essentially comes down to what are the set of fundamental beliefs that you hold that drive everything that you think, everything you say, all of your actions. And it's kind of interesting, like, how do we get our worldview? Well, there are different views on this. Some of it just comes down to a mystery. If you're Reformed, you'll say, well, God gives you your worldview, and that's just how it is. If you go with something like free will or limited free will, it's more of a mystery, right? There are some external influences like your parents and how you grew up, but then there's also maybe stuff that God gave you, or there's stuff that you genuinely came up with on your own. Now, what the Bible explains a little bit is explains the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in Genesis 2:17. This tells us that we at the very least have a knowledge, and the Hebrew word for knowledge has two different connotations. One literally is knowledge, and then the other is desire. And so along with that, it's later explained in Genesis 3 how we can have Genesis 4. No, actually, Genesis 3 and Genesis 4, when God says there will be contrary desires between man and woman sometimes. Your desire will be for your husband. And also Cain in Genesis 4, where God says, sin, beware, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you. And so what we can learn from this is we can actually hold beliefs that are against each other, that they don't mesh, that they don't go in unison, right? And so that is pretty interesting. Yeah. And of course that the love of God leads to change. So choosing a particular set of desires over others leads you either more towards God or against. That's
yeah. I think that's a good point too, that we start to see the first, theological assumption maybe that if God does exist, that there maybe is an objective truth, and it's our job to align ourselves with that, changing towards something that's correct.
Exactly. So this is all, of course, your personal philosophy or your personal worldview, which is up to every person themselves, really.
It's individual.
At least that's Frontline's view. And so on to epistemology. So a sub-branch of philosophy is called epistemology. Comes from two different Greek words, two different Greek parts of word smashed together. So there's episteme, which is knowledge, literally, and then there's the study of, which is that logia ending. So in English, it's epistemology, where we get our ology ending, is literally like study of or story of. In this case, it means the study of. So this is the study of knowledge. And primarily it has these four different questions. What is knowledge? Where does knowledge come from? What can be known? And how can we come to know something? Generally, philosophers will break down the first question, what is knowledge, into at least three different categories. There's declarative knowledge. So this is knowledge that I know that something. It's something that I can form a declarative statement about. So, for example, I can say Princess Diana died in 1977. Yeah, there we go. Maybe I don't actually know that. That is a declarative statement, and it posits that I know a particular fact about something. And so breaking down of this is in order to possess declarative knowledge about something is a belief that must be true and justified. So I must believe it in order for me to actually have knowledge about something. Like if I don't believe that something is true, well, how could I possibly know whether or not it's true? If it's not actually true, well then it's not real knowledge, and if my belief is not justified. So for example, if I say, I know what next week's lottery number is going to be, and I make a guess, and then it turns out to be that, well, I didn't actually have true, valid knowledge that the lottery number was going to be whatever it was, because my reasoning was unjustified. I was just making a guess. It's not something that I had a valid claim to. So then there's procedural knowledge. So procedural knowledge is different from descriptive or declarative knowledge in that it's not based on belief, rather it's based on your ability to do things. So it's knowing how to do something. If I know how to throw a baseball and hit that wall over there or hit the fan, I might not be able to describe exactly how I'm going to do that, and I don't necessarily need to be super firm in my belief about that. I just need to be able to do something. So it's either like I can do it or I can't do it. And then there's experiential knowledge, which is also called knowledge by acquaintance, and it's something that I might not be able to describe or not be able to perform, but I still have knowledge of it. It's like knowing what green actually looks like. And so, for example, if someone's blind and they haven't been able to see color, or maybe they're colorblind and then they get a special operation and they're able to see color, you can tell just how that knowledge is being unlocked in them. They'd never actually experienced what green was like or what strawberries tasted like, etc. As far as where knowledge comes from, there's many different potential sources of knowledge. Philosophers propose reason, perception, memory, and testimony all as possible options. In addition, the Bible itself gives us its testimony, like the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and the fear of the Lord, for example, trust in the Lord. Proverbs 1:7. And then, of course, like we are all familiar with trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. Proverbs 3:5. So that's like what the Bible says. And then once again, there is just a lot of openness about this. Like it can be difficult to know where knowledge comes from unless you're told from the Bible. Well, knowledge comes from God. What can be known? So in Scripture, 2 Timothy testifies to this exactly. All Scripture is God-breathed and is useful for teaching, for reproof, correction, for training in righteousness. Creation as well, that by studying God's creation, we can come to a greater knowledge. And then there's this thing called the regress problem. So this specifically is talking about the limits of our knowledge. And the idea is, how can I know anything? Any logical deduction that I might make has to start with an assumption. And if I go figure that out, well, then that has to have an assumption. It has to have an assumption all the way forever. So how can I say that I know anything? And this really gets down to the crux of the issue, which is there has to be a fundamental belief or a fundamental truth to something, or fundamental set of truths that are self-defining. If you don't have that, you can't believe anything, in which case there's no purpose to even talk about this. There's no purpose to even propose or even believe that nothing can be believed. So
where agnosticism comes in. The only thing you know for sure is you don't know anything for sure.
Yeah, exactly. And so these people who believe that nothing can be known are called like epistemological skeptics. And there are there's a couple different dilemmas that they propose. Well, one's called like Agrippa's trilemma, which proposes that essential idea that either a rational deduction has to be either dogmatic in that, well, it's just basically self-defining. Like, well, a tree is a tree. Okay, that doesn't really tell me anything besides that a tree is a tree. Or circular, meaning that all of the deductions have to rely on each other. So tree is a tree is another simple example of that. Or it is a infinite chain of deductions, and with no end, basically.
Which we're gonna get into deduction and that sort of stuff in a minute. So
of course, the regress problem, or like Agrippa's trilemma, they're divorced from reality. So it's primarily an attack on what's called rationality. And so that's where we get to our last point. How can we come to know something? And there's two primary views on this. One is called rationalism, and then the other is called empiricism. So rationalism is the idea that I can make logical deductions and come to a knowledge of everything. At least at its extreme, I can start with one assumption and then make my way all the way to being able to know everything. That's the theory. Empiricism, on the other hand, says nothing can be known purely by deduction. You instead have to go out and make observations, make tests and observations, and then infer what the truth is, what knowledge actually is from your observations.
And this is going to be the crux of the problem for science and how that interplays with religion.
Right.
Yeah.
So we're going to, this was all a build for this, and this is where we're going next.
Yeah, exactly. And so something like the regress problem primarily deals with an attack on rationality.
Right.
That you can't know anything purely from deduction because there's always an assumption, and you can't genuinely know whether that assumption is true or not.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's two technical Latin terms, a priori and a posteriori. Knowledge. And so a priori is the idea of knowing before. So it's without prior experience is the idea. So that's the idea of rationalism, that I can determine something, I can have knowledge of something without prior experience. And then there's a posteriori, which is the idea of after experience. I need knowledge of something, I can obtain knowledge of something after experience.
Right.
So
Cool. Yeah, great setup.
does anyone have any questions about that? No?
Okay.
Go.
So we're going to get into now how does this apply. So that was very good. Also very abstract, so sorry we just threw a ton of terms at you, right? We're going to break it down, go a little slower here. I guess to back up and get to the big picture of the class of what we're trying to do, a lot of what we've been teaching prior to this, it was very descriptive, like the Mormonisms and Jehovah's Witnesses, and there wasn't very much disagreement allowed. So hopefully my goal is in this next course that you can see two different perspectives here from two different disciplines almost. So Cal was just talking before we got here. He's definitely more on the science side and empiricism and these sorts of things. I love philosophy. I think philosophy is fascinating. He doesn't. So hopefully that we can get two perspectives here and really start to break down the issues of what we both ultimately agree on from two different perspectives. So it's pretty cool, I think. So where we're at basically is how can we know something? I think it's helpful to look at this through a story of history. This became a huge deal in about the 16th century. There were two different strains of thoughts, right? You had these two ideas, empiricism and the rationalism. The main person that kind of brought this out was named Rene Descartes, if you've ever heard that name before. He was a philosopher, and most people actually attribute him to the creation of the scientific method, right? The idea of how can we learn things about the real world, and that basically pushed us onto the path of the Enlightenment, right, of science in general. And Francis Bacon specifically was the one that actually solidified the scientific method later, right? So ironically, Descartes was not an empiricist, though. He was a rationalist. He thought that we could know things just by the sake of knowing them. So let's first define rationalism. So rationalism is the belief that reason is the basis for all truth, and it believes that knowledge can be acquired through reason alone, deduction. All right, so deduction is going to be the practice of how we can apply rationalism, if that makes sense. We're going to contrast this with induction, which is the other type of reasoning. These are the two different types of reasoning that is associated with empiricism. Okay, so I know we got a lot of words here, but we're going to go slow, and hopefully we can build this whole picture here. So what Descartes would say, or any rationalist, is that there's two ways to acquire truth in rationalism. You're going to have innate ideas and then subsequent deduction. The innate idea is a really fascinating concept. So what they would say is there's certain things like the law of contradiction or cause and effect that we just know, we're just born with them. Yeah. And so the law of contradiction is a good one. Like if I say this wall is green and then I also say this wall is blue, you guys all know that one of those can't be true. But why do you know that one of those can't be true? Right? I mean, everyone knows it's true, but the empiricists would say that you had to gain that from experience. The rationalists would say, no, that's innate from you. And that could have come from something either like God. If you studied ancient philosophy, Plato's forms was one way that they would say you got this idea from. Or people would say past lives, right? You got that from like past life, something along that. But you notice the key is they always refer to something external of where you got the truth, not from the external world. Like I said, like something of a higher authority. That makes sense. So that's kind of the basis of deduction and where it can get you, or what the rationalists believe. It's very similar to, like I was saying, Plato's idea of the form. So Plato kind of believed that, it looks like you know what I'm talking about here.
Yeah, we have to remember up until this time, Plato and Aristotle, their logic and reason, that was everything.
Right.
Yeah.
You're right.
Till after the cart, and then we turned the corner.
You're 100% right. Yeah. So philosophy, and in general, kind of came from Plato and this Greek tradition, and it really is actually the Muslims when they took over that area really brought it out, and then the Middle Ages kind of took that from the Muslims, the Christians in the West did, and this was everything. Like Aquinas and all these people worship these philosophers. So you start to have people really question authority, and that's the main key. Is that we got truth from authority before, and now you have people like Descartes that are starting to question everything. So how can we actually know anything? So for Descartes, he was saying, if you come up to me and say this is true because the Bible says it's true, well, how do I know that the Bible is true? Right? We got to start questioning. We got to start going back and keep going. So his explanation of how he can explain this comes down to deduction, like I said. I think it's more helpful to actually show an example of deduction versus induction to know what he's talking about. All deductive reasoning phrases take place in three forms. It's A plus B equals C. All right, and the two premises, A plus B, have to be true, and if those are true, C has to be true. The classic example is a triangle. So if a shape is a shape and it has three sides, then it has to be a triangle. It would be how you would phrase this. So the first premise is that you have a shape, and that if that shape is a triangle, and it must have three sides, right? So then if you go outside of that and you find a shape and it has three sides, you must conclude that that is a triangle. That's solid reasoning, and there's no way around that, right?
Assuming the premises are true.
Assuming the premises are true,
Yeah.
right. So the first thing that we get here is that this is inherently definitional, right? We didn't go out and make up anything new. We're just defining what a triangle is.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's kind of the basis. Do you have anything you want to add there?
Yeah, so, well, as far as then Plato and Aristotle are concerned,
Right.
this definitional nature makes it ironically difficult to interact with the real world. For example, what's a chair? What exact atom do I have to remove for it to become not a chair? You know?
Right.
And the same thing can be applied to a triangle. Well, what's the perfect triangle? Is it one that's like taller, or is it one with all equal sides?
Mhm.
Right, and so with these particular ideas, it can be difficult when you try to reconcile concepts with the real world.
So Descartes actually took this to its logical conclusion, and Descartes was an extreme skeptic, and his what he would say is that the senses that we use to view the external world are inherently intrustable. We cannot trust them. All right. So he said that, like, a judicial hearing is a great example of this. You can have people that will be expert witnesses that will say, I was there and I saw this person do something, and then we'll have video footage of that person being in Alaska during the time of the murder.
So was his argument that collecting evidence can be unreliable, and that the mind was more reliable?
No, yeah, well, he would say reason. So
Reason, okay.
Reason is external from the mind. He would say even your understanding can be flawed, right? So he very famously comes to his final conclusion of what can actually be known as I think, therefore I am, if you've ever heard that. What that means is that the only thing we can know is that we exist. Because if you take this to its logical extreme, is that I can think, right? And if a thinking thing exists, then I exist. And other than that, you have nothing.
Yeah, like I can't simply observe you thinking and conclude that you exist because my senses are fallible.
Yeah. So what he would say, if you guys have ever seen The Matrix, that's a good example of this thought. He actually said, imagine you're being completely possessed by a demon, and the demon is showing you everything that you want to see, but none of that actually exists. Is that possible? Absolutely, it's possible, right? So basically, what can be proven? Nothing except that I exist. Kant, who's another philosopher, took this one step further, and he said, well, if you exist and you're interpreting something outside of you, then something else has to exist as well. So all we know is that you exist and something else exists.
You can think it might be there.
Yeah, right, exactly. But we don't know what that is. So that's where we're left with induction or with deduction and rationalism.
Yeah. And of course, many other people tried to build on this, right?
Sure.
Particularly concepts of free will and whatever else. Like, well, if I don't control everything, then, you know. But generally speaking, you have philosophers that are either basically Descartes, like, well, I can only know I exist.
Mhm.
Some people would go further and say, you can't even know that. Some people would go with what Kant says, well, you can at least know something else, but you can't know what shape or form. And then even more than that. So there have been many, many, many attempts. In the realm of philosophy, if something can be believed, it probably has been.
It's a good way to put it. Yeah, it's a spectrum, right?
If we go back to the ancient Greeks, they had the sophists. And they were the guys that just went around trying to figure out a way to make arguments. What was put on to make it didn't matter. It was how do you argue it. And they become the lawyers now.
Yeah.
It's all about the spin.
Yeah.
So the sophists, they were bad people.
Yeah. Well, that's a good point about the ancient Greeks. Is I don't think I have.
Also, don't you think it's ironic that Descartes spent his whole life trying to figure out how much reason can show, and he found out that reason can only show one thing?
Yeah, it is fascinating. Yeah, so because he was like, we're going to prove everything exists, and we're going to have truth, and all these guys, their ultimate goal was to for power. Basically, they wanted to be able to control nature, and it's kind of ironic that he gets to his final conclusion, which is like nothing exists except for me. So it's kind of funny, but
of course is ironic because again ironic. Mm-hmm. If nothing exists except for him, he should be God, right? He should be able to control everything.
Right. So he's starting to get into another concept when we start to get in like Nietzschean philosophy of God and you becoming your own truth, right? So
we're going to get into that more next week.
We will. So you can see the logical conclusions of these ideas starting to seep in the 16th century, right? This directly leads to today.
And that's specifically ontology, right? So when we're talking about knowledge, a lot of times it's not what is true out there. Mm-hmm. They're instead asking, what can we know about that truth?
Right.
So
yes, yeah.
Okay, so the distinction is they wouldn't say you don't exist, but
they would say I can't be certain that you exist.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. This is all about proving. Sorry, I should have started this off that way. But so the idea is like certainty, because people are coming in with religion and saying this must be true because the Bible says so, but these guys are extreme skeptics, right? And many Christians would say that you shouldn't be that much of a skeptic, but I tend to believe with them that skepticism is probably the way to start. But like we're saying, if you stay a skeptic like Descartes, you end up literally might as well just hide in a corner because you can't do anything else. So.
Yeah, and at that point, like you said, there's no purpose to life. You can't be certain of purpose to life. And so if you find yourself living in contrary to your what you claim to be your knowledge, well, maybe it's not really knowledge. Maybe
that's a good point.
Maybe you need to actually adapt what your real beliefs are and work from that as it is knowledge. So
Descartes, the way he got around this, I think is faulty reasoning. Personally, as I said, I think therefore I am, so I exist, and if I exist, something created me, which is God. So God exists too. So Descartes was actually a Christian.
Logic.
Yeah, but I think that's kind of a bad argument of a way for him to get around it, and most people do too. I think that we can only really get to us existing through pure empiricism.
Rationality.
Rationalism. Yeah, rationalism. Briefly, like you were talking about Aristotle. Aristotle is what we would call like a soft empiricist or a soft rationalist. So he kind of like took the middle ground. And I think that's probably a better way to do it, but we'll get into that too. So we can go on to the next one here. Unless anyone has any questions on deduction.
Okay. And to be fair, these terms were pretty recently defined as far as like the 1600s or so.
Yeah.
And not way back in Aristotle's time or Plato's time. So they were very, like Aristotle and Plato were a lot more over here, and then over here, and then over here, and less, I would say, disciplined as far as a particular aspect of thought. So
virtue. You're trying to find virtue.
Yeah. Well, that is a good point too about what is the ultimate goal of these sorts of ideas. So the historical idea is that there was actually 4 disciplines going on at the same time. So you have science, you have religion, you have magic, and then you have technology. All right. And most people would take religion and magic and put them together and say that those are like aesthetic beliefs, right? We can't prove any of those. And then you would have technology and science would go together. But C.S. Lewis said that's an entirely wrong way to look at it. And you should really be looking at it as magic and technology are together, and then science and religion are together. And the reason is those concepts are only trying to gain 2 things. right? Science and religion are trying to gain truth, and technology and magic are trying to gain power. All right. So when we're talking about empiricism and reasoning, it's more about technology. It's how do we gain control over the world, because they're starting to implement something like the scientific method and starting to become very technologically advanced.
Yep.
All right. So so the question that we should often ask when we're doing these sorts of things is why? What are we looking for? And C.S. Lewis also said the main difference then between science and religion is that science is trying to find out what the world, or how to make your mind conform with the world, and religion is trying to take your will and conform it with God's will. All right. So if we're going to look at it, a big picture of what we're trying to gain, I think C.S. Lewis is dead on there. That's probably a good way to look at it. All right, inductive reasoning. Sorry, that was a little bit of a side tangent. But, inductive reasoning, empiricism. This is going to be the opposite side. I'm trying to think about. Bacon's probably the best person to talk about with empiricism.
Yeah.
But this idea is that we don't have ideas like law of contradiction come from themselves. They would say, well, the only reason you know that's contradictory is because you've experienced something like that in your real life. Like when you were first born as a baby, you didn't know anything. You didn't know about the law of contradiction. You learned that through experience.
Yeah.
All right.
And when you tried to put the circle block into the triangle hole and it didn't fit, you learned that two things can't possess the same space at the same time.
Yeah. So as you can see, right off the bat, this seems a lot stronger than deductive reasoning. But as we're going to get into both of these, there's certainly issues with both. So the key is observation only is what you get to know, and you're not born with anything. You don't have any sort of truth. The application of this would be Bacon the scientific method. So the scientific method is that you pose a hypothesis. You say that if you do this one thing and we repeat it over and over and over again, that this is going to be the conclusion. And then you test it, you take mathematical samples and statistical analysis, and then you can come to a conclusion at the end, saying, well, this is probably what happens. Right? We're looking at the outside world and trying to obtain truth, assuming that the outside world does exist and it's real, unlike Descartes would say. Sorry, I missed assumptions on the last one. There is one assumption to deduction, it's that truth is knowable. So if truth is knowable, because if truth isn't knowable, you can't do anything, right? The assumptions of empiricism is there's actually a lot of them. We're going to get into that later.
Yeah.
But one of the main ones is uniformity. We'll get into that in the next slide.
Yep.
And then also there is a little bit of combination between
for sure. Pretty much no one is a pure rationalist or pure empiricist.
Mm-hmm.
They generally meet in the middle to some degree. Some people prefer more leaning on empiricism. Some people prefer leaning more on rationalism. But as far as I can tell, there have been very few philosophers or scientists or whoever who have said, well, it's only empiricism or it's only rationalism.
Right, and we probably already talked about the big ones that did say that.
Yeah.
And even if you notice my example about deduction in the beginning, about the triangle, I mean, you have to know what a triangle is and observe what a triangle is to even believe that. So in a way, deduction relies on induction.
And also, another thing I'll note, we're talking about knowledge of truth, right?
Mm-hmm.
Very, very few philosophers ever posit that there is no truth.
Right.
Instead, they will posit Descartes or someone else that, well, maybe you can't be certain about the truth. But he'll say there is truth, you just can't know it necessarily.
Well, yeah, except for the postmodernists. Now.
So now, with Nietzsche, there came along the idea, not that there is no truth, but rather the truth doesn't matter.
That might be a good way to say
and that's what postmodernism is.
Yeah.
The core of postmodernism is all about. So.
Yeah, cool. Okay, any questions on empiricism before we get into why the problems with both of these?
Well, you mentioned Bacon, and he did, like I said, this is where technology, he came along with the idea that technology and logic, science was going to solve all our problems.
Solve everything.
Yeah. We all want peace. That's logical. We all want peace, and we should all have peace. What's the problem? See, so so Lyons now he's to the point where, and that's why they call it the Enlightenment. Now everything's going to change from there on down.
Yeah. So great point. Also, like, what would Bacon think if he would have lived to today and saw where the Enlightenment got him?
And And we're
That's
still
true.
working on it.
Yeah.
We still think we're going to solve all the problems.
Oh, we do. Yeah.
There's a couple great quotes from him, but of course, yeah, Francis Bacon, he codified, the first person to really codify the scientific method.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And there's a great quote that I love from him, which says, "The first sip of philosophy turns you into an atheist, but at the bottom of the cup, God is waiting."
That's a good one.
Which is pretty cool. Anyway, so
Cool.
move on.
All right, so we're going to get into some issues with this. We already hit on how far can deduction take you. Answer is basically to you exist. But we didn't talk about induction. And induction sounds great because, to be honest, it works, right? We have the scientific method and we've created technology and we really have conquered the world in so many ways.
Yeah.
But we're not talking about if it works. Sorry, Gowdy.
Sure. Yeah, and a key feature about that, if it works, right, is making that guess in the future. And if we can repeatedly make guesses that are correct, we're inferring our knowledge. It's kind of like that declarative thing where we're creating a different justification from deductive reasoning. We have a different justification for our belief about the truth.
Yeah. So. Yep. Yeah. So, but the key here is to take a step back about moving from technology back to science. All right, because technology has the goal of power, as C.S. Lewis would point out. But science has the goal of knowledge, right? So we're talking about what can actually be known from deduction. Answer is you exist. What can be known from induction? I would like to argue the answer is nothing, that there's nothing that can actually be learned from induction in a provable sense of the word, right? That we can know for certain. The main reason, we're going to get into this next week, that's probably going to be our main goal, but to give you a taste of it, let me take this clicker here. So if we're going to apply the scientific method to something like gravity, something that we know exists and that has to exist, we would say, like, let's say I'm going to posit that gravity, if I drop this thing infinite amount of times, it'll always fall to the ground, right? I'm not going to drop it, but if I did, I think you would imagine what would happen, right? It's going to fall, hit the ground, and I can test that. I can do it over and over and over again. I can see that it happens and happens every single time. So the next step would be, how do I know that this is going to happen the next time, right? How can I prove that that will happen every single time? This is where mathematics comes into place, right? Statistical probability. So we're going to take a sample of the real deal, and there's different ways we can do this and some mathematical proofs to know, but we can gain essential certainty based on the size of the population and how many times this thing takes place to know what percentage of confidence we can have. And I know that's kind of obscure, but the main issue with this idea is that the actual population is infinity, right? Gravity can happen over and over and over and over again. So our sample, doesn't matter how big we make the sample, the statistical confidence that we have that will drop the next time is actually zero because the sample or the population is infinity. So what can we learn from induction is nothing from a knowledge standpoint. We're going to break that down and get into that a little bit tomorrow. But at the end of the day, it works, right? The scientific method does work. The more we treat it and the more we use it, we come to conclusions that practically work. So then what you have to start asking is, what are the assumptions of science? And what do we have to take for granted, right? That's uniformity. So our guessing is that if I do this thing under these conditions, it'll happen this way every single time I do it, right?
And every single time I reproduce the initial conditions,
Yes.
I can reproduce the effect.
You can reproduce the effect. So the philosopher would ask, why does that take place? Why are things the same today as tomorrow? Why doesn't this wall just dissolve today? The Bible posits an explanation for that. So it's actually the Son, the person of Christ, of Jesus, or the person of God, the Son, holds the world together as is, so that things are knowable and that we can learn about God through the way He has created the world, right? So very fascinating, but like the point of C.S. Lewis is that where can science take us of what we can prove without something else to appeal to? From induction, it's nothing. From deduction, it's that I exist. So, yeah.
Still not very much.
Not very much, right.
And that's why a key assumption about induction is, like you said, that things are uniform,
Yeah.
right? If the laws of physics don't change, then I'm able to trust what I inductively
Right.
conclude from my testing.
And we're also starting to see now the importance of assumptions, of how these are just full in science and
that's really your core beliefs, right?
your core beliefs.
And oftentimes people will hold beliefs that are contrary to themselves, right? They'll say, well, I don't believe that there's God, but then go on living as if there's purpose to life.
Right.
Those two things are fundamentally in conflict with each other.
Mhm.
And getting to the bottom of that is a really, really great way. Well, one, to maybe make people question their purpose for existence
Mhm.
is maybe not just happiness.
Right.
But two, to really get them to think and try to figure out what are the most true or the most maybe justifiable beliefs that they can hold.
Mhm.
And when they start seeing everything in society building up around one
Yeah.
God.
Right. Right. And then also with something like uniformity, if we're going to take it for granted and say that it exists, as Christians, that's a very easy thing to do, right? If God does exist and he wants us to learn more about him, he's going to create a system that's possible to know about him. As the atheist, you have no reason to believe in uniformity, that things are going to stay the way they are today as they are tomorrow.
Yep.
So that's a little taste into how we're going to start breaking down science. And sorry, there's a lot of background here. We were talking about epistemology and reasoning and how does it interwork, but as you can see, all that leads up to our assumptions of science. And that's going to directly lead us to what can science tell us and how it can be used by Christians specifically, probably more effectively than the atheists, I would claim.
Yeah, exactly. So, in conclusion, how does this apply to your Christian life and your theology? A lot of it is just knowing what are your core beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to take the Bible and its testimony as truth, then that draws a very different picture of where you lead your life from as to, say, an atheist, as to someone else. And that's one of those things where you start to realize, well, the Bible is way more true than simply words that I believe more than the latest Stephen King novel.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I don't know that we've mentioned, but one of the ideas behind science, one of the key ideas that Bacon had about science is, well, if the Bible is the book of God's words, and that's testimony to us directly from God, or at least mostly directly from God, what about the world? Is the rest of the universe testimony to us from God as well?
Oh, right.
And so that is really his big meta theory, the idea that by observing the book of God's words, we can learn more about God, but also by observing the book of God's works, we can learn more about him. And there's no purpose to observing the world if not for that. Or at the very least, the highest purpose to observing the world is to actually learn more about God.
Right.
So,
Cool.
where does your worldview fit? Is it consistent with rationality? Do you prefer empiricism? You can have all sorts of mixture between those if you want. What is the Bible? What does the Bible say? What does the Bible teach us to do? Does it teach us to search and observe and test? Does it teach us to start with one assumption and draw everything from that? Where does it fit? As far as my thing, I believe it encourages us to observe God's creation. Isaiah 40:26, lift up your eyes on high, see who created these. Who brings out the host by their number, calling them all by name, by the greatness of his might, etc. Or Psalm 8:3, when I look in your heavens, the work of your fingers. Romans 1:20, for his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, having been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in things that have been made. I believe the Bible teaches us to investigate God's creation. It teaches that God did create and he is seeable in his creation. It teaches us that we would be wise to seek out knowledge, so knowledge is attainable, and we should seek it. Proverbs 18:15, an intelligent heart acquires knowledge, an ear of the and the ear of the wise seeks knowledge. Tells us to search for God and trust Him. Matthew 7:7, ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and it will be open to you. And it makes clear that we cannot know everything, which is basically all of Job 38 and 39. If you've ever read that, who are you? Explain to me how the eagle got its feathers and can fly, etc. And in particular, I love Job 38:4. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. And so the point is, the Bible says, we cannot know everything. We have to have a certain set of fundamental beliefs about where those things came from. And you can see that by observing what is in front of you, whether it's the book of God, whether it is the creation of God.
Yeah. Otherwise, we'll end up like Descartes.
Otherwise, we'll end up like Descartes and just huddling in a closet, trying to pretend that the closet doesn't exist.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess next week we're going to start to get into the practical application of this. What does the Bible tell us we should assume about science? That's very key, right? We're going to actually argue that the practice of science is inherently religious because there's so many assumptions in it that come directly from the Bible. And that without belief in those assumptions, you can't do good science. You can't do good science.
You can't do science at all.
Yeah, otherwise you can just have blind faith.
Exactly.
Try to use this thing that appears to work. So yeah.
Cool. Any final questions or?
I think I was thinking about it always kind of annoying me even going through college and seeing how people are so much into research and scientific stuff. It always makes me wonder what's the balance of finding the truth and just like you guys were saying, many of those philosophers and scientists they wanted knowledge to get power, right? And to feel the power that they know something.
Yeah, exactly.
And many times when I'm in class, that's what annoys me because I feel a little bit of arrogance that those, not every professor, but here and there I'll hear it's more about the knowledge itself than how that can be used for God's glory.
Right.
Exactly.
Exactly.
And worship the creation.
Yeah.
Right. Yep. Yeah, that's fancy.
Yep. So I think what you guys are saying, it comes to the point of okay, in Brazil I never heard about critical thinking. I'm hearing study here, and I think there's some good, like you guys are saying, but then it comes down to the point of what's my intention of seeking for those knowledge, right?
Exactly.
It's to learn something that I can use for God's glory to get to know Him, or it's just for the sake of feeling myself good that I know something.
Exactly. That's the whole idea of knowledge is power, right? Which is a fairly modern idea,
right?
In the sense that instead of it being a genuine searching for knowledge or genuine searching at religion or science, which leads you to God, it's instead a corruption of that, turning that into power, aka knowledge is actually the same as technology or the same as magic.
Right. Yeah, so on that point about that power that I was talking about with C.S. Lewis.
But that's one of those, sorry.
Yeah, I'll wrap up real quick. That Bacon said that the only reason he used the scientific method or technology over or magic was that the technology actually worked and magic didn't. Right? So it's not like they wanted to throw that out. It's the idea that this is the goal that we're trying to get to. And you're right. Maybe it should be something more like religion, right? How do we glorify God instead? So
yeah, exactly.
Cool. All right, thanks guys. Sorry we went a little late.
Yeah.